I mean, before we dive into the extraordinary content of these tapes, we have to stop, I think, and not skip past the incredible fraud that's been perpetrated on this country at the direction of Kevin McCarthy, who saw Trump's conduct as egregious as I do, as the three of you have uncovered, Jackie, in your reporting, and Neil and Miles in your expert analysis. The fraud he's perpetrated on the country as the leader of the Republican Party is one of the most ghoulish things I've ever seen in politics, Neil.
Was that to me? Sorry.
Yes. I mean, just
so yes, I completely agree with you, Nicole. I mean, McCarthy is probably sitting at home right now praying that Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to say something sufficiently insane for people to try and forget about what he did this weekend. But I don't think it's going to work, because what this really shows is cowardice. It also shows some complicity, because I think the revelations over the last weeks have really underscored that the Republican Party was far more in it when it comes to January 6th than one would hope. I mean, we've talked about Mike Lee, for example, someone I had a lot of respect for, and he looks like a secret coup plotter. And so this fraud that you're talking about on the country, McCarthy's definitely part of it. He wasn't the only one. And, you know, to me, it's just so sad, because it reflects kind of not just the ambition of these politicians like McCarthy. Look, politicians in D.C. have always been ambitious, but it's the total destruction of principle, what you called a backbone at the start of the show. I mean, you know, as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But in a pinch, it looks like for McCarthy, the chance to be Speaker of the House is going to do the trick for him. And, you know, McCarthy was for resignation, according to these tapes, before he was against it. And I guess what I just want to say is, and this may sound naive, but I came to Washington in 1996 because I saw a shared purpose. And sure, there were Republicans that I disagreed with, and Dems too, but it was so much on the up and up. It was about trying to make society better, and people disagreed about the means, but there was a role for principle, a role for honesty, a role for backbone. And that's all gone. Now it's just, you know, people like McCarthy just trying to get ahead, say anything, do anything, lie to the American people in order to do this. And, you know, it's just so sad. I mean, the last thing I'll say is just like, it's like so much with the Republican caucus now, the drama here is like high school. I mean, McCarthy denies talking smack about Trump, but then he finds out his friends were secretly tape recording him the whole time. I don't know if his like next statement's going to be like some Instagram notes app apology or something. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I want to not gloss over either the importance of investigative journalism. A lot of what we know, we don't know. There were very few Miles Taylors in the Trump administration. A lot of what we know was not revealed by people who sort of saw the cowardice and saw the frauds and saw the misconduct. A lot of it was uncovered by reporters. And I want to play one more piece of sound from Jonathan Martin on Rachel Maddow last night about how much there is left to hear with our own ears. There are more tapes. Listen to this.
We have a lot more on tape from this period, which is at the highest levels of American politics. It is sensitive, it's delicate, and it's high stakes, and we have it all on tape. And it's going to, I think, tell a very different story about this period than the story that many people are trying to tell right now.
You know, and I guess my question for you, Jackie Alemany, is what is the sense, and you have some great reporting about the damage control that Kevin McCarthy started to do. I don't know if you'd heard that or not. It sounds like after this interview aired on Rachel Maddow's program. You write this: former President Trump and House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy spoke on the phone Thursday night about a newly released audio of McCarthy telling Republican leaders that Trump should resign in the wake of January 6th. Of the attack on the Capitol. It's according to two people. Trump, according to people, wasn't upset about McCarthy's remarks and was glad that the Republican leader didn't follow through, which Trump saw as a sign of his continued grip on the Republican Party. They spoke of the private conversation anonymously. I mean, that is almost more ominous than anything. Trump knows that McCarthy knows what he did, but Trump knows his brute power to dominate Kevin McCarthy is so complete, he's not losing any sleep over this.
Right, Nicole, this goes back to so many of, I think, what our conversations end up coming back to, Trump's grip on the Republican Party, and this is proof in the pudding that Trump sees himself, and that he was pretty nonplussed about, and was sort of reveling in this controlled this iron grip he has on the party and the leverage that he has over Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. That doesn't mean that McCarthy isn't necessarily going to have to embark on some sort of forgiveness tour, maybe make a few stops on Maria Bartiromo, Tucker Carlson, kiss the ring at Mar-a-Lago. But the president views this as the former president views this as a reinforcement of the fact that Trumpism is still well and alive, and that that McCarthy didn't ultimately call for him to resign. But the one line that we can talk more about the dynamics of the party and sort of more of the speakership battles and what McCarthy's facing, but I can't get out of my head one of the lines in that tape that McCarthy said, which was, "Now, this is one personal fear I have. I don't want to get into any conversations about Vice President Pence pardoning." And that, to me, is what I think captures why the committee wants to speak to Kevin McCarthy, because it demonstrates that McCarthy was legitimately worried that Trump would only leave if he could get a pardon for criminal acts. And it almost insinuates that McCarthy potentially thought that the former president might have committed some criminal acts there. And so I think, the timing of this tape also is bad timing for a number of reasons, but I think also further reinforces why the committee wants to talk to people like Kevin McCarthy, Jim Jordan, and those who are showing very different about faces than they were in the days after the January 6, 2021 insurrection.
It does a lot more than insinuate, Neil. If you just look at Trump's pardons, let's put the history of presidential pardons aside for a moment, because there was nothing normal or historic about the Trump presidency. Trump only used the pardons to pardon his political allies, by and large, for committing crimes. Steve Bannon, I think, was pardoned on the last day for his felonies. I mean, the whole idea that Kevin McCarthy didn't even want to talk on January 10th or 11th about not a Pence pardon, but the Pence pardon, assuming that Trump would be gone and Pence would have to deal with a pardon for the ex-president because of his criminal conduct. It is corroborated by reporting by Jackie's colleagues, Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker, in the White House counsel's office on January 6th. They sat there expecting that Donald Trump would be charged that day with crimes. We keep coming back to crimes committed in plain sight with the complicity and participation and witnesses up and down the ranks of the Republican Party. And I think it's why there's this almost bursting exasperation that they continue to glide above the rule of law.
Nicole, you used the phrase earlier that McCarthy is a material witness, and I think you and Jackie have hit the nail on the head in isolating this line from the McCarthy tape, them talking about whether a pardon might come up or not. You don't talk in normal conversations, and I've been in so many in the government, about pardons. The only reason you're talking about a pardon is because you think a crime has been committed. So when McCarthy says that, what that means in ordinary English is he thinks a crime was committed. He doesn't want to talk about it and be part of an obstruction of justice conspiracy or anything like that. And that's why McCarthy needs to be asked under oath about exactly what this conversation was. And, if I have any criticism of the January 6th committee thus far, they've obviously done a lot of important work, but they kind of voluntarily asked McCarthy and said, hey, tell us about the role on January 6th and the events, and McCarthy said no. That's not good enough. We have to be subpoenaing these people to get the truth. They've shown they're not going to talk about this stuff voluntarily. I think that is the law enforcement mechanism available to the congressional committee to get this. It should be used. I expect a court battle. It doesn't mean that, the rest of the committee's work can't go on while that court battle is proceeding. But it looks like McCarthy is just afraid to tell the truth and talk about what's happening. The last thing I'd say about the pardon is there's also this school of thought that Trump actually kind of wrote a pardon to himself and put it in his pocket. There's a whole debate among constitutional scholars, can a president pardon himself? Obviously, what McCarthy's talking about here is the kind of Nixon deal in which the president resigns, the vice president pardons. But there's still this other possibility still floating out there, and Donald Trump is foolish enough and, frankly, unconstitutional enough to try something like that.